Hello, my name is Annie Bracey, and I'm here to talk to you today about some of the research I've been involved with, which is focused on documenting movement of common terns to address conservation issues in the Great Lakes region. I am currently a graduate student in the Conservation Sciences program at the University of Minnesota in Dr. Francie Cuthbert's lab. And I also work at the Natural Resources Research Institute in Duluth, Minnesota in Dr. Alexis Grindy's lab, and have been able to study common terns both for my dissertation and for continued work as well. So to keep with the general theme for this year's session, the changing habitat, I thought I would provide an overview of the challenges that common terns face when the resources they depend on for survival intersect with those that are heavily utilized by humans, and discuss how the potential additive effects of a changing climate could create new challenges for this species as well. The common tern has a global distribution and is one of the most well-studied avian species. Today I'm going to focus on North American populations and particularly birds nesting in the Great Lakes. Human activities in coastal ecosystems have been the primary drivers of population declines worldwide for common terns and other birds that depend on coastal habitats. These declines have been well documented, and especially in heavily human-altered landscapes. In the late 19th century, collection of eggs and use of bird feathers in women's fashion led to significant declines in tern populations, as well as other bird species. By the end of the century, the common tern was nearly extirpated from the Atlantic coast and other inland nesting areas. The passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918 led to a relatively quick recovery of common terns, and by the 30s, much of their original range and population numbers had rebounded. However, in the 1970s and 80s, there were significant declines again, primarily associated with contaminant exposure, but with continued efforts to reduce environmental toxins and legacy pollution, the populations again rebounded, but numbers are still lower than historic highs. The ability of many of these species to rebound with directed actions has inspired and motivated conservation efforts for migratory species. However, the continued presence and growing pressure associated with a growing global human population means that chronic long-term conflict, even if unintentional, with coastal dwelling birds continues. Human disturbance, including the development of coastal habitats, predation pressure, pollution, and habitat degradation, have greatly reduced the availability and the quality of formerly used nesting sites. Because of significant habitat loss, many colonies of common terns and other tern species nesting in the U.S. Atlantic coast and Great Lakes are actively managed on artificial sites, such as dredge spoil islands, old remnant piers, and other artificial platforms, which have become important nesting sites for terns, especially in areas where natural sites are relatively non-existent. Despite these challenges, it's expected that many of these sites across the breeding range have benefited these species greatly. And they likely will require continued management efforts if the populations are to maintain their current numbers. Of course, this can be problematic since management efforts often rely on the activities of specific people and individuals rather than institutions. And managing tern habitat is sometimes overlooked when agencies are tasked with managing habitats for multiple species, multiple purposes, and are stressed for dollars. A lack of long-term commitments means an uncertain future for breeding colonies in many locations in North America. Management of artificial sites and restoration of natural sites are critical to maintain these populations. Although restoration can be expensive, the benefits, of course, are manifold, especially when non-target species also benefit. Oftentimes, those non-target species include migratory shorebirds, which are in great need of staging habitat as well. This is just an image from a really exciting restoration project that is currently in progress at Interstate Island in the Duluth-Superior Harbor. The 2020 image is from restoration activities that have been ongoing since spring and will continue next year to increase the footprint of the island and secure this important breeding site for common terns. And maintaining nesting sites, of course, can increase productivity, but it cannot directly address issues of habitat degradation and contamination, which are often issues in highly urbanized locations where terns nest. In addition to these challenges, the predicted environmental impacts associated with climate change may make these underlying risks even greater. A study from researchers at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center analyzed banding data from birds nesting in the Great Lakes to assess their vulnerability to climate change. And for common terns, their greatest vulnerability was their capacity to adapt based on specific life history traits, which include long-distance migration, having habitat specialization both during the breeding season and the non-breeding season. They specialize on small prey fish, which could make them vulnerable to a warming ocean. And they also have high breeding site fidelity, which could result in persistent failed attempts to breed if nesting habitat becomes unsuitable. The three broad categories of climate that are expected to affect terns are hydrologic changes, increasing temperatures, and increased storm intensity. Sea level rise is a major long-term threat. The common tern's dependence on low-lying coastal habitats and small marine and freshwater islands make them susceptible to inundation of nesting sites by water. It will also result in intensification of erosion of coastal and island habitats. And in the Great Lakes, we know we've been seeing historically high water levels, which are expected to fluctuate, but also to increase as well. Ocean warming has consequences for birds that obviously rely on marine resources. Seabird populations are predicted to decline as sea surface warms, and it's predicted that populations could decrease rapidly if the frequency of warm phase anomalies continues to increase as it has in the last decade. Again, fish-eating seabirds are sensitive to both thermocline depth and sea surface temperature, which can affect the survival and behavior of the cold water prey that they depend on, and it also places greater physiological demands on adults for locating food for both themselves and for feeding chicks. The intensity, frequency, and duration of hurricanes and intense rainfall is expected to increase as well, putting coastal ecosystems and the birds that rely on those habitats at great risk. Hurricanes can cause mass mortality of staging, migrating, and nesting birds, but also destroys critical habitats by altering beach profiles and nesting substrates. So how do we deal with this seemingly endless list of risks that birds face in a human-dominated world? Luckily, there are many people working diligently to understand how these risk factors affect bird populations to better inform conservation of both birds and the habitats they require to survive and to sustain. Effective management of any population requires an understanding of factors that influence survival, breeding productivity, and dispersal. And for migratory birds, that obviously means a regional and global focus is critical and requires broad-scale cooperation and international partnerships, which would facilitate the study of birds during their full annual cycle, which is required to identify where populations are most vulnerable. So how do we obtain this critical information? There are lots of ways to do that, but one piece of the puzzle, which is simple, is to identify where birds spend time throughout the year and assess risk and direct conservation actions based on that information. And that is what we've been working to do with birds nesting in the Great Lakes. We've used multiple tracking technologies, including solar geolocation, global positioning system tags, and radio transmitters. Each of these technologies are complementary, but used to address different questions about tern movement and behavior. Solar geolocators were used to identify large-scale movement of terns nesting in freshwater interior lakes, including the Great Lakes. And this allowed us to determine the degree of migratory connectivity of these inland colonies, look at timing and duration of migration and overwintering, and identify specific locations where they spent their time. The GPS tags were used to identify finer scale details about adult migratory movements and to document foraging behaviors of adults in freshwater habitats during the breeding season. And then last, we used radio transmitters to document juvenile dispersal. And this research was all done at 2 nesting colonies in western Lake Superior, in the Duluth-Superior Harbor, and in Ashland, Wisconsin. And each of these tracking methods allowed us to gain new knowledge about this species that could potentially be used to assess risk. The geolocation study, again, identified large-scale movement patterns. Although individual birds may use the same routes each year, there was significant variation in the timing and duration of migration among individual birds, which can be very useful in documenting timing of migration and how that could affect their exposure risk to hurricanes and other things during migration. We found weak connectivity within inland populations, which means there's a high degree of mixing, and most of the birds that we tracked spent the winter in coastal Peru, which is likely an important wintering site for many of the birds that breed in the Great Lakes region. It's a well-known region, important to lots of different wildlife, particularly birds, because of the Humboldt Current that results in very nutrient-rich waters. The fine scale information that we obtained using the GPS tags was to document foraging behavior of common terns during the breeding season. And coupled with stable isotope data, we were able to identify how the location that adults foraged influenced their exposure to mercury, and birds that foraged more predominantly in the river were exposed to higher levels of mercury than individuals foraging in the open waters of Lake Superior. And exposure was also significantly higher for birds nesting in the Duluth-Superior harbor compared to those nesting in Ashland, Wisconsin, which has a significantly lower historical and present-day human footprint. The GPS study also revealed greater detail about adult movement during migration and identified several important locations used for staging during migration. On the left-hand side, you can see here in Lake Erie, and as well as Florida, and nearshore waters in coastal Peru during the winter were heavily utilized. And then in the middle here, I just comparing the tracks that we obtained from the birds that we tracked, and compare that to the currently active MODIS stations, just to verify that radio transmitters would likely be a good method to track juvenile tern movements, since these are archival methods. We had to retrieve the bird to get the data, and so with juvenile birds, because of their deferred breeding, we would likely not handle them again, so we were able to use the radio transmitters to track them, and which they will fall off the bird on their own, and we'll get the information as they pass the radio receiving stations. So, like I said, we decided that radio transmitters would be ideal for tracking juveniles based on the adult tracking data. We tracked birds using the MODIS wildlife tracking system, which, if people aren't familiar with, it's a really great resource for researchers. It's a coordinated network of automated radio telemetry receivers that detect registered tags at any active receiving station, and they can be placed anywhere in the globe. If a bird passes by it and is registered, it will be detected. So this collaborative effort has greatly aided in understanding animal movements, particularly bird movement, and has helped inform conservation efforts for numerous species. It's an excellent example of international cooperation, which has been used to forward conservation efforts. Again, this technology allowed us to track juvenile terns, which is a huge piece of missing information critical to understanding population dynamics. Where do they winter? How long do they stay there? When and where do they prospect prior to recruiting to a breeding population? So we just put the transmitters on juvenile birds this field season, so 2019 and 2020, and have already gotten some information and continue to track these birds as they're moving probably gone now, but from Lake Erie as well, you can see that has been a location that a lot of our birds have been detected. So what have our tracking studies told us about population risk to migrating common terns? Basically, their life history traits align unfortunately well with predicted environmental shifts that will likely reduce the availability of already limited habitat, even further change food availability and quality. And we know that our birds are reliant on coastal marine waters in Peru, which could be affected significantly by changes in sea surface temperature. And we know that that's been an issue for seabirds there during severe El Nino years as well. And the loss of the impact of hurricanes, of course, could be an issue for critical habitat that's used during migration to stage for staging adults, and also particularly for locations where juveniles are expected to overwinter, such as the Gulf of Mexico, Florida, and along the east coast of North America. So in light of these predictions, we need to know more about their overwintering ecology, including the degree of winter site fidelity. Do they return to the same wintering locations, or do they change annually based on resource availability? We need research to focus on habitat use, food availability, and potential local scale threats like contamination, urbanization in coastal Peru. How do foraging patterns alter with human disturbance or prey availability and climate change? We know that their prey niche widens during strong El Nino conditions due to changes in prey availability and abundance, and that depletion of lipid-rich fish stocks in Peru have been associated with reduced survival for many seabirds. We'll need to use additional techniques to identify local threats and potentially risks. Although it seems lofty, the long-term goal would be to shift breeding populations to sites where they can be self-sustaining. But if that is not a possibility, it's very important to remain diligent in efforts to protect the species, because our actions have affected their ability to be self-sustaining. It's been incredibly enjoyable to work, do my research on this species. It's a beautiful bird, and it may prove to be adaptable in ways that we cannot predict based on its life history traits. Common terns do very well in human-dominated landscapes, despite all of the challenges, and I hope that they will continue to be part of the coastal landscape where they are beloved by so many people. And I hope that I'm able to continue to do research on them, and I'm thankful to all of the people who have taught me and continue to teach me about this species and conservation. With that, I would just note some of the major support for the research that I've been involved with. Again, most of this work was done through my research in Dr. Cuthbert's lab, and now again continuing in Alexis Grindy's lab at NRI. And I love all of my lab mates, and we have a lot of really cool projects, and I just, yeah, thank you for taking your time to listen, and I will look forward to potential questions in December. Thank you.